Imagine you walk into a supermarket and head straight to the meat aisle. You see chicken, you see beef, you see pork, and sometimes tucked away in a smaller section, you see duck. But here's something strange. Nobody seems to care whether that duck was male or female. With chickens, the question gets much stranger. Male chickens from egg-laying breeds create a major problem for the egg industry because they don't lay eggs and aren't the same type of bird raised for conventional meat production. But what about ducks? Because ducks have males too. And male ducks are not some useless version of a duck. They're called drakes. They grow, they eat, they develop muscle. And in many meat-producing duck systems, males are absolutely capable of becoming food. In fact, research on Pekin ducks has found that males can actually have higher body weight and carcass weight than females at market age. So now the question gets more interesting. If male ducks can make perfectly good meat, why don't we ever hear about eating male ducks? The answer begins with a distinction most people never think about. A duck is not just a duck. The breed matters. And this is where the chicken comparison starts to fall apart. Think about the chickens you see in a supermarket. There are chickens bred primarily for producing eggs, and there are chickens bred specifically for producing meat. Those two purposes have shaped the birds themselves. Ducks work differently. Some duck breeds are primarily associated with eggs. Others are specifically bred for meat. And one of the most important meat ducks in commercial production is the Pekin. Pekin ducks are extremely fast-growing. Properly fed commercial Pekin ducks can reach around 90% of their adult weight by about 7 weeks. That changes everything. Because if you're raising a meat-type duck, you don't necessarily have the same problem that exists with an egg-laying chicken flock. You aren't raising thousands of birds whose primary purpose is to produce eggs and then suddenly discovering that half of them are the wrong sex for your production system. You're raising a meat animal, and both sexes can contribute meat. That's why the question isn't really, why are male ducks useless? They're not. The better question is, why doesn't the sex of the duck matter to us as consumers? And there's a surprisingly simple answer. Because by the time the duck reaches your plate, the industry has already made that decision for you. Imagine a commercial hatchery. Eggs go into incubators. Days pass. The ducklings hatch. Some are male, some are female. And unlike the story you may have heard about male chicks in the egg industry, meat duck production doesn't require the males to be treated as worthless simply because they're male. In fact, commercial meat production can raise male and female ducks together or manage them separately depending on the production system. Researchers have even compared Pekin ducks raised in mixed sex and separate sex groups because sex can affect growth and carcass characteristics. And here's the part that sounds almost backwards. In some studies, the males aren't smaller, they're bigger. One study comparing commercial Pekin ducks found that at 49 days, males had significantly higher body weight and carcass weight than females. Another study of Pekin strains found that male ducks had higher body weight, better musculature, and higher fat content than females. So if you're imagining a hatchery looking at male ducklings and thinking, there's no use for these, that's simply not the right picture. Male ducks can be valuable meat birds. There's another reason this gets confusing. When you hear the phrase male duck, you might picture the classic colorful drake swimming behind a female mallard. Green head, bright feathers, beautiful markings. It looks nothing like the white duck you see on a dinner plate, but that's because the ducks we recognize in nature aren't necessarily the same birds being produced for commercial meat. Commercial meat production uses specialized breeds and strains. White Pekin is one of the major examples. Pekin is a meat-type breed that grows rapidly and is widely used for duck meat. And that means the dramatic difference you imagine between male duck and female duck isn't necessarily what you're looking at when you see commercial duck meat. The bird has already been selected for production characteristics. Its sex is only one part of the equation. And here's where the chicken comparison becomes useful again. With chickens, the word chicken hides two very different production systems. The chicken that lays your breakfast eggs is not necessarily the chicken breed used to produce the chicken breast in your refrigerator. That's why the question about male chickens is so compelling. But ducks don't fit neatly into that exact story. Duck meat production already exists as its own industry. And the birds raised for meat are selected because they grow quickly and produce desirable carcasses. In one extension guide, Pekin and Muscovy are identified as the main duck breeds raised for meat. So when a male Pekin duck grows into a large muscular bird, there isn't an obvious reason to throw away its value simply because it is male. It's already part of the product the farm is trying to produce. But now there's an even stranger question. If male ducks can be good meat birds, does that mean male and female ducks are completely interchangeable? Not exactly. Sex can affect how a duck grows and what its carcass looks like. Male Pekin ducks have been found to have greater body and carcass weight in some commercial comparisons. Other research has found differences in breast muscle, fat, and other carcass characteristics. And with some breeds, the difference between males and females can be dramatic. Take Muscovy ducks. The male Muscovy, the drake, develops a particularly large breast muscle, with the male's breast muscle providing a significant advantage for meat production. In other words, being male isn't automatically a disadvantage. For some ducks, it can actually be useful. So the idea that male birds aren't good for meat is simply too broad. It depends on the bird, the breed, the production system, and what the farmer is trying to produce. And male ducks often are. So if someone asked you tomorrow, why don't we eat male ducks? The technically accurate answer isn't because male ducks aren't useful. And it isn't because all male ducks are discarded. It's much simpler. We do eat male ducks. The sex of a duck just isn't usually something the consumer sees. You buy a package of duck breast. You don't buy a male duck breast. You buy duck. And that distinction tells you something important about how modern food production works. The industry makes decisions long before the food reaches your shopping cart. Breed selection, growth rate, feed efficiency, body size, and ultimately, meat quality. By the time you see that duck in a supermarket, you're looking at the final result of all those decisions. And that is why the question sounds stranger than it really is. We aren't avoiding male ducks. We simply don't label the meat by sex. And that is completely different from the situation with male layer chicks. That's the key distinction. Male layer chickens are a problem created by the economics of egg production. Male meat ducks are part of the economics of meat production. One is a mismatch, the other is a product. And that difference is easy to miss because both animals simply become duck once they reach the grocery store. You don't see the hatchery. You don't see the breeding program. You don't see the growth records. You don't see the decisions made about which birds are most efficient to raise. You just see a package. And that's one of the strangest things about modern food. An animal can go through an entire production system before you ever have a chance to ask what it was. And sometimes the answer is surprisingly ordinary. Male ducks aren't some forgotten category of animal. They're part of the meat industry. They're raised because they can grow into valuable food. And in some systems, their male sex can actually come with advantages. So the mystery isn't really about why we don't eat them. We do. The mystery is why we rarely think about it. Because modern food systems are designed to hide most of those distinctions. Breed becomes a product. Sex becomes a statistic. And the animal becomes a package. And once you understand that, the original question almost disappears. Because the real story was never about male ducks being unwanted. It was about what happens when biology meets economics. Different birds are shaped by different goals, and those goals determine which animals become common on your plate. So the next time you see duck on a menu, there's a good chance you're looking at the end of a much longer story. A story that started with a bird, a breed, and a decision about what that bird was best at. And somewhere in that story, male ducks stopped being a mystery. They were never missing. We just weren't looking for them. Male ducks aren't ignored because they're male. They're simply part of a different production story than most people imagine. And that might be the most interesting part, because the food system around you is full of animals whose stories are much more complicated than the labels suggest. Sometimes, all it takes is one simple question to uncover the whole system. So the next time you see duck on a menu, remember, there may be a much longer story behind that one word. And sometimes the strangest question has the simplest answer.